Okay, we should be broadcasting, but I'm not seeing it on my computer. Webinar will start, should be starting. Okay, let's see. It's on now. Hello, 17 attendees. I think I can see them. Let's see. I'm connecting. Yes, people are appearing. Good. Hello all, and welcome to this March 9th, 2020 webinar. I'm George Reese. I'm the treasurer for ICTM, and I'm pleased to introduce you to Sean Nank today. What you're looking at now is the ICTM website. ICTM sponsors these free webinars, so we hope that you will join us by going to ictm.org and signing up to become a member if you're not already. I also have up on my screen that I hope you're seeing the invitation to go to the NCTM Centennial Annual Meeting and Exposition in Chicago. Really looking forward to it. I know that there have been many questions about NCTM taking place at McCormick Center and response to the COVID-19 virus. There has been discussion there, and NCTM has put out a statement that they are continuing to monitor the outbreak and spread of the coronavirus disease called COVID-19. And they hold the health and welfare of participants in utmost importance and are following the guidance of authorities. So they're continuing to monitor the situation and are in discussions with McCormick Place. For your health and safety, wash your hands frequently and properly, and avoid close contact with people who are sick. Avoid touching eyes, nose, and mouth, and stay home when you are sick. We encourage everyone to follow the prevention guidelines of the CDC. So that's what we know about NCTM Centennial Annual Meeting and Exposition at McCormick Place. So right now, that's the situation. So, I don't want to forget that as part of this webinar, we are going to have a giveaway of a whiteboard flip chart. And you can create dynamic and reusable anchor charts. This is a 10-sheet one, and you must be present to win, by which I mean at the end of the webinar, I will tell you what to enter into the chat so that you can be entered into the drawing for this whiteboard. And then we'll let you know in an email later if you won. So that'll be happening at the end. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Sean Nank. Sean has received the Presidential Award for Excellence in Mathematics and Science Teaching. He's a distinguished teacher in residence and an adjunct professor at California State University, San Marcos, and a full professor at the American College of Education. He works for the Oceanside Unified School District. He's published many books and articles and K-12 math curricula. He's a facilitator for illustrative mathematics and LearnZillion. He has started his second term as president of the Greater San Diego Mathematics Council, and he is on the MARC team for NCTM and is a representative from Western 2 District. His research agenda includes how teachers negotiate the balance between the procedural, conceptual, and application via technological resources, incorporating student voice in the classroom, and capitalizing on students' passion related to mathematics. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to our speaker, Sean Nank. I encourage everyone, as you have questions, to enter them into the question and answer. I will be monitoring both those and the chat during the session, and we'll call or collect the sessions or the questions to give them to Sean. So take it away, Sean.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And let me just share my screen and start my slides. So today we're going to talk about standards-based grading, how it works and how it fosters student learning. I could talk to you for a half an hour about all of the research associated with standards-based grading, but I'd much rather talk to you about my experience with it and how you actually take standards-based grading and use it in your classroom in an effective manner. And we might bleed into some conversations about how you can use this when you might be in a department that, for lack of a better phrase, some people might be resistant to standards-based grading, or if you're in a school or a district where they're doing traditional grading and you need to merge your standards-based grading with the traditional grades of an A, B, C, D, or F in any type of environment. So we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of how to effectively implement standards-based grading, but do so knowing that some schools don't 100% integrate standards-based grading. So why should we talk about this? First of all, a little bit about who I am. I've been teaching this is my 24th year of teaching now, and I started standards-based grading about 4 years ago. A colleague of mine came to me and told me about standards-based grading, and my first thought process was I didn't want a touchy-feely, everybody special type of grading system in my classroom, but that's not what it is. So I'm really excited that I said yes to this colleague and decided to go through this endeavor with them. So that's what I look like right now. Just in case you're going to the NCTM Centennial, I don't think I'm going to donate my hair, but if I do, then just look for that guy because usually my hair is pretty short. What I'm about is, well, basically people don't buy into what you do, they buy into why you do it. If you want to look at the core of teacher beliefs, all you have to do really is open up their grade book. That will tell you what teachers endorse, what they believe in, and how they're judging their students on a daily basis. So if you look at a traditional grade book, you're going to see tests, quizzes, homework, maybe participation. You're going to see a lot of compliance grades. What I like most about standards-based grading, I'm not going to say it's unequivocally not compliance. There's always a certain amount of compliance in an educational milieu, but we're talking more about what students actually know and why they know what they know. Why it matters, I'll be upfront and honest in telling you that if I didn't have a daughter, and there's my daughter right there, she's just did her first competition dance of the year yesterday, and that's her a couple years ago in her hip hop solo routine. If it wasn't for having a daughter going through the educational system, seeing through her lens and her eyes what traditional grading does and how it formulates in people as early as kindergarten or even pre-kindergarten, their conception of themselves as mathematical thinkers, then I probably wouldn't have been as open to standards-based grading. But seeing how students through her eyes view themselves with regular grading, let's just say I'm really happy that I made the transition. So our goals for this day are to learn about standards-based grading. And it's not what a lot of teachers think it is. It's not, like I said, that touchy-feely type of grading. It's more of a holistic way of looking at what students know and what students don't know so you can get them to master standards. It's about really isolating the standards that they're strong at and the standards that they need more work with. Also understanding the key factors of implementation. We're going to talk about scales, we're going to talk about standards, and we're going to talk about growth mindset threaded throughout standards-based grading. We're going to detail how to use standards-based grading to reward mastery over time. And within that, I'm going to talk a little bit about a concept called grading for learning. And we're going to reflect on how you can do this on any scale, whether you're the only person in your entire district who's doing it, or if your entire department is, or your school or district, you can do this on any scale that you want. So the first question I asked myself when somebody came up to me and said, let's do standards-based grading is, why should we do standards-based grading? Why should I change what I've been doing for the last 20 years? For me, it was a matter of students should master standards, not tests. If you're teaching out of most curricula, you're going to have multiple standards within a unit. So when you formulate the test for that unit, what's more concerning for me is understanding the standards that students mastered and the standards that they need a little bit more work on. If we look at an overall test grade, It tells me a little bit about the student, but it doesn't tell me specifically what we need to work on in the classroom. So I want to grade standards. I don't want to grade entire units. It doesn't mean that I'm segregating the standards, but what it means is I can have informed conversations with students, parents, administrators, counselors about exactly what the students know and exactly what they need help with. Students can be confident and vulnerable with standards-based grading. What I mean by that is, what does a 68% on a test really mean? If you're grading on a 90, 80, 70, 60 scale, is a 68%, does that mean you're a D student? Does that mean you're a C student? What if you turned in a little bit more homework? Then does that mean that the knowledge that you've encapsulated for mathematics because you did a couple more homework questions is of the C rather than the D range? And we know in the educational institution, a C versus a D is a world of difference in terms of the trajectory of students throughout their educational careers. And we need to change how we assess students. Right now, with a growth mindset, I've been in a lot of classrooms when I've consulted where they're all about growth mindset. They do a wonderful job with growth mindset. But what happens is once we get to assessments, growth mindsets unequivocally stop. It's September 24th. What do you know on this day? If you know it, great. If you don't, too bad. You have an F and you have to build up from there for the rest of the semester. That's something that we want to get away from. So what is standards-based grading? In a traditional grading system, and I know there's exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, you're assigning points to steps. One way that people try to make traditional grading better is sometimes after step 1 or 2, if students don't get it right, the rest of the steps, they get no points at all. A better system under traditional grading is if they go wrong on one particular step, then what you do is you follow that misconception. And if they had gone right on step 2 or 3, then you follow the rest of the steps and you see if they completed steps 4, 5, 6 after that. But if you notice in everything that I said in the last 30 seconds, it's all about the steps. You assign 1 point here, 1 point here, 1 point here. I want to get away from that, and I want to talk more holistically about student understanding. That's a very procedural way, traditional grading of grading students. You're looking more at steps. And the biggest thing for me under traditional grading is that I'm looking to see where they go wrong, and I'm looking to see where I'm taking points away. Under a standards-based grading model, it's more holistic. So it actually shifts my mindset as a teacher when I sit down and grade tests and instead of looking at points to take away from students, what I'm doing now is I'm looking for points to give to students. I'm looking for them to show me any way that they understand conceptually and procedurally the mathematics. So it's more holistic in nature. And I'm able to let the small mistakes go. Or if you want to ding them for the small mistakes, they're not nearly as costly under standards-based grading as they are with traditional grading. If I know a student knows how to add 5 and they don't add 5 properly once or twice on a test, then I ask myself, is that the major goal? Am I assessing basic addition and subtraction strategies? Or can I let that go knowing that they know how to add, they just made a mistake and they know conceptually and procedurally what to do with, let's say if they're in an 8th grade math class or a geometry math class. So you have basic options for standards-based grading. And I'm gonna tell you before I get into that is, I'm reminded of a quote that says something to the effect of, embrace those who seek the truth, but beware those who say they have already found it. I say that because if you find somebody who says that they have the answer, they know exactly what you as a teacher should do, then politely run in the other direction. I'm not doing that right now. I'm not saying that I have everything figured out. What I'm sharing with you right now is my experience. And what's more important for me is that you engage in the conversation so that you're more willing to think about how we grade students and how we are making meaning of their meaning of mathematics, especially in terms of their grades. So at first, for the first year of standards-based grading, we tried a 5-point scale. I did not like that scale because there were particular ambiguities in regard to that scale. What would happen is the 5 was okay, the 4, but once we got to a 3 and a 2, we had a lot of discussions within our professional learning communities about what a 3 is and what a 2 is and what a 1 is, and we couldn't get a lot of consensus. So instead, what we did during the second and third year of implementation is we use a 4-point scale. It made it a lot better because it was a lot easier to talk about what's the difference between a 4, a 3, a 2, a 1, and a 0. It's another misconception about standards-based grading is students can get a 0. Sometimes when people do standards-based grading, they think that everybody should get a 1 if they write anything at all. Now, some of my students, not many of them, but a couple of them, when they take a test, they try to write for some problems that the answer to everything is Chuck Norris. As much as I appreciate and laugh at that, that's wonderful, but they get a 0 on that. So you can give a 0 with standards-based grading. What I'm looking for with a 1 is more, are they setting up the problem right? Are they on the verge of starting to understand the mathematics inherent in the problems that we're giving them? But beware the 10-point scale. The more points you have, the more ambiguous it becomes, because what happens with the 10-point scale, 9 is an A, 8 is a B, 7 is a C, 6 is a D, and anything under that is the vast realm of Fs that we can give them. So I try to stay as much as possible away from the 10-point scale because people tend to start thinking in terms of 90, 80, 70, 60%, and we want to get away from that. So how this works with traditional grading, what's going to happen usually, and what happened for me, is there was a subset of people in my math department who embraced standards-based grading. There were about 5 of us who started to do it in the first year. So we needed a system that would take the traditional scale and take our standards-based grading scale and integrate when it's time to report on the student's progress at the 6, 12, and 18-week mark, whether they have an A, B, C, D, or an F. So there were 2 options, and by the end of the second into the third year, we actually started using these 2 different options because we found out that me and one other person, let's just say that I tend to give students a little more of the benefit of the doubt in terms of grading them. And there were some colleagues who did not give them as much of a benefit of the doubt. We understood that I was more likely to give a student a 3 than some of my other colleagues. So we used 2 different scales in order to compensate for that so that we were more aligned given our abilities and our default to give them the benefit of the doubt more or not. So we use these 2 different scales. The reason why we have these scales up there is not so that a student says, I have a 2.85, so I have a B in the class. It's more so that we can take the grades and we can give them to administration so that then they can report on a traditional report card. Psychologically though, when we talk about the difference between a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4, if a student has a 0.5, if you notice on this scale here, if they get a 2, they have a C. So difference between a 0.5 and a 2 is 1.5. Or even over here on this scale, the difference between, let's say they have the 1.5 and a 3, you're only talking about if you have a 1.5 to a 3, 1.5 points. It's not really points, but that's the way they conceptualize it. Now we know that to get from an F to a C under traditional or standards-based, they're going to have the same amount of mastery, but psychologically, if you have a 20 and you need to get to a 70, they're thinking that's 50%. How can I ever do 50%? So it seemed like even though they had to do the same amount of work under standards-based grading, they thought that it was going to be easier, so they were more likely to engage in doing the work to go from an F to a C or a B or an A. And let's face it, you can't have a cool abbreviation with traditional grading. I can't call it something like SVG, so I just like the abbreviation. One of the things that was difficult in the beginning was clustering standards. In other words, if you don't cluster standards, and if you do standards-based grading, then you will probably quit within the first month, and I do not blame you. There are a lot of standards for every grade level. So what I'm suggesting is instead of grading every single standard, because you're going to have over 50 standards by the end of the year, it's going to be really difficult to keep track of. What we want to do is we want to cluster standards. So let's say we're talking about in Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2, we'll use linear, exponential, and quadratic as a model for these are the things that I'm teaching in this unit. So you have a couple different ways of thinking about it. You can have 3 different standards here. You can talk about linear, exponential, and quadratics. Within linear, exponential, and quadratics, according to the Common Core, they need to distinguish, construct, and graph. So if you know here, just with these iterations, I don't want linear, distinguish, construct, graph. Exponential, distinguish, construct, graph. That's 9 different standards right here. Instead, I want 3. I want linear, exponential, and quadratic. Within those 3 clusters, what I want to do is see if they can distinguish, construct, and graph. But you don't have to do it that way. You can take the linear and exponential, or you can take the distinguish, the construct, and the graph. If those are more important to you and your PLC, you can make those the leads, and you can see if they can distinguish linear, exponential, and quadratic, construct linear, exponential, and quadratic. So for me, it's not necessarily a matter of exactly how you cluster the standards. What's more important is that you're talking with your colleagues, and that dialogue is going to make you better educators, and it's going to help you do and be better for your students. Just make sure that you're clustering the same so that you can have similar conversations using similar vocabulary. Here's a single point rubric that we kind of started with, but we realized that we wanted much more than that. I'm going to show you a couple different rubrics just to say develop a rubric, but don't get too intertwined in the idiosyncrasies of the rubric. You want a rubric so that you can talk about what a 4, what a 3, what a 2, what a 1 is with your colleagues so that you can align your grading and so that you can really figure out what matters within that standard procedural and conceptually and what you're more willing to let go of. So it's more about the conversations that they invoke. If you're going to use rubrics, which you're probably going to need with standards-based grading, have a rubric for you, have a rubric for your colleagues, but then also have a rubric for your students. This is something that I have up on my wall, and it's a way of students understanding what does it mean if I get a 4 or a 3 or a 2 or a 1. And over here, there's just kind of a quick scan of what it means, but over here, I talk a little bit more in terms of a growth mindset of what it means and what you have to do. The biggest thing is right here in the middle. Where am I now? Where am I going? And what do I need to do to get where I need to be? The whole aspect of standards, identifying what students need to do and what teachers need to do in order to get them where they need to be. There's other rubrics you can use of a 1, 2, 3, or 4 denoting mastery. So you can talk about linear functions and understanding the fluency, exponential functions as well. These are 2 different standards. We decided to go with the different functions, and within the functions, talk about different things that they wanted to do. So for this, it's a matter of using exactly what we know about the functions, what we want them to be able to do, but then you're going to have to streamline this because you can't go through every single bullet point for every single assessment. It's just going to take too much time as a teacher. And let's be honest, as teachers, we don't have enough time. Another thing that you can think about is the aspect of incomplete, approaching, meets, and exceeds standards. For me, quite honestly, though, I put this up as an example of a rubric that some people use at districts that I consult with who are transitioning to standards-based grading. This is my personal opinion. I do not use exceed standards on a 4, 3, 2, 1 scale, because if they exceed standards, then that gets a little ambiguous. Are they supposed to take questions on a test and do more than you ask them to do? Is that exceeding standards? Are you going to put questions on a test that are going to, let's say you're in a 6th grade standard, are they going to test 7th grade standards? I wouldn't do that, by the way, because it annihilates self-perceptions of mathematical abilities. So I'm not a big fan of exceeds, but again, it's a matter of realizing what you need as teachers, what your students need in order to make sense of what a 4, 3, 2, 1 really is. So I know this is a webinar, so this is going to feel a little bit contrived, but I'm going to stop talking for a few seconds. This is an example of one of the problems that we gave in one of our unit tests, and this is already graded by the teacher who is using traditional grading. So in every one of our PLCs, we had some teachers using standards-based and some teachers using traditional-based grading. So this is an example, and I'm going to give you about 30 or 45 seconds to just kind of look at this example and what the student work is. So if you have questions about this, please feel free to put it in the portal. Now's the point in time, if we were face to face, that I would give you more time and we would have a dialogue of understanding what the student knows and what the student needs to learn. If you look at this, there's a lot of different numbers here, including corrections. If you look at this number 3, which has multiple steps, the student over here received no points for this aspect for filling out the table, no points for the initial fee, no points for the graph, no points for the equation. They received only 1 point, and this was worth a lot of points. So they basically not only received an F on this problem, but they received just about the lowest F you can possibly receive. By getting 1 point on this, the highest grade this student could get on this test is a C. So I ask you to look over here, if you can see my cursor, on 32 minus 6. The student said 32 minus 6 was 28. So they subtracted 4 instead of subtracting 6. For this particular problem, I would say if you take that one minor mistake, first of all, if we're really concerned with subtracting, they consistently subtracted 6 perfectly from then on. They just subtracted 6 wrong the first time, which then threw off every aspect of this table, which then threw off the initial fee, which then threw off, now, if it was my student, yeah, it'd be great if they simplified this equation, but even so, this equation is, given that one tiny mistake, accurate. Their graph is accurate. I would say for me, this student is a 3 or a 4, maybe a 4, because they understand conceptually the point of intersection, the initial fee, the application. They just subtracted 6 wrong once. In a traditional class, this student received a very low F. In a standards-based grading class, this student would be probably an A student in my standards-based grading class. So this is one of the reasons why I really like standards-based grading, because I can take and look at it holistically and ask myself if they made a minor misconception or just a minor computational error that I know they can do. And if so, I'm going to give them a 3 or a 4. The other thing that's nice about it is you could say under traditional grading, could a teacher have done that under traditional grading? And the answer is yes. But it's a matter of when I make standards-based grading assessments, what I do is I try to use more than one problem so that I can see overarchingly what the students are doing, what they're thinking, what meaning they're making. Now, in students' conceptions of grading, it's an aspect of asking yourself, what do they know? What are they thinking? What do they need more help with, conceptual aspect or the procedural aspect? So I'm going to give you just a little bit of data here. The first piece of data is, and I did not mean for this to happen, but after doing this program for about a year, I went in during the second year and I asked all my students in all my classes, do they want to go traditional or do they want to go standards-based grading? The first semester, every single one of my classes said that they want to be in a traditional scale. So I agreed to that. At the beginning of the second semester, I asked them again, and every single one of them in every one of my classes said they wanted to go with standards-based grading. So we transitioned to standards-based grading again during the second year of the program. Now, forgive me here, this is not a typo. What you need to understand with this data is in my school, we have certain teachers who will take the top students. I'm not one of them. So what happens is anybody who received an A or a B or a high C, they go to certain teachers. Anybody who received a low C or a D in their previous math class, they go to me. That's an entirely different webinar about the trajectory of student existence and their conception of mathematics and their perception of themselves as mathematicians and tracking. So I won't go into all that, but all that to say, I was happy to have 1A in all of my classes. If you notice what happened here though, is some people are worried about grade inflation. I didn't have all the Fs shifting all the way over to As. What I had more so is a lot of the Fs moved to the D, which moved to the C, which moved to the B range. So instead of having a distribution skewed towards the F, it did not skew towards the A. What happened was students were more likely to isolate and identify what standard they needed help on. And I was too as well. And when they came in for me at lunch, we didn't review the entire test. It was a matter of you did really well on standards 1 and 2, hence the message, you're good at math. We just need to really concentrate on standard 3 so that you can understand that before the next test. And for a comparison overall, this is comparison from 2017 at the end of the year to 2018 at the end of the year with the same classes under traditional versus standards-based grading. And you might be thinking, even though all my students in my classes were the D and C students, that it might be a gen ed class. It is a gen ed class, but 50% of my students in these classes were gen ed, 25% of them were SPED, either IEP or 504 plans, and 25% of them were English learners with multiple languages. So my pitch to you is that this works with any curricula. You could be using any type of curricula. When you use your assessment, you can use a standards-based grading protocol, and it doesn't matter how you teach. It doesn't matter what curriculum you're using. It's more about the assessment component. Another thing that really helped the students is within standards-based grading, and this is in my opinion where standards-based grading really pays off, I had a grading for learning protocol. What grading for learning means basically is that they get to do retakes. But within standards-based grading, it's different. What happens is if a student takes a Unit 3 exam, instead of telling them they received an F on the Unit 3 exam and having them retake the Unit 3 exam over and over and over again, what we'll do is we'll integrate previous standards into current units. Now, the catch is that as we integrate those standards, what happens with the standard is it gets just a little bit more difficult progressively each time. So if I have a standard in Unit 2, I don't have to give a retake for that standard. What happens is in Unit 3 or 4, if it's an important standard, what I call my deal breaker standards, like if you don't get this, you're not going to be successful next year, then what I'll do is I'll integrate that in a meaningful way within the curriculum and the pedagogical strategies. And then that standard will show up again 1 or 2 units later. But what happens is we tweak it a little bit, we add a little bit to it, so it's a little bit more difficult. So for me with standards-based grading, if they can prove mastery, so if they take a Unit 2 test and you have a standard in October, and then that standard's revisited in the middle of November, what's grading for learning allows me to do is go back and change previous grades based on them proving a further level of mastery. So the aspect of when can I retake tests, my pitch is when we take the next test, because we are going to be repeating certain standards. How can I bring my grade up? Well, with that, I talk about you're strong with standard X and Y, but we need to concentrate on standard Z. So it's a really targeted kind of conversation. And when students ask me about extra credit, I'm not a huge proponent for extra credit because if students are failing, they need to concentrate on the things that we're doing in the classroom. But why do extra work when we haven't mastered the standards? Student pushback for that is, yeah, but I have an F and I need to make up points. I need to recuperate my F and have a C, B, or an A in the class. So what happens is with grading for learning, I build that in. So they get that extrinsic reward for coming in with me and getting extra tutorial sessions so they can prove mastery. I'm just putting this up really quickly to tell you that this is what my grade book looks like. If you see a little triangle up here, what that means is if I go back and I change a grade for any reading because they've shown me current mastery over prior standards, I mark what the previous grade was so I can track it and so that the students and parents can track it as well. Another thing you'll notice up here is, oh, and by the way, we could talk about homework as well. I am required to make homework, 10% of my grade in my educational institution. But over here with the 100s and the 200s and the 300s, what I do is standard 1 is going to be 101, 102, 103. So if you see here with 201, 202, 203, 204, you'll see that there's been 2 quizzes and 2 tests that have visited this standard. The second standard is a really important standard. So what I want to do is I want to shift student and teacher and parent and administrator thinking from what did I get on the Unit 3 test to which standards have I mastered and which standards do I need more work on. It creates a much more targeted conversation. Just to give you an example of, we're integrated in a Math 1 class. These are my clusters of certain standards within the first few months of the school year. So what we felt as a PLC was important was solving equations, graphing, building models, linear and exponential models, simplifying expressions. Those were our first 5 standards. And what I do is as I add a standard, because you're going to need a weighted score in there, I just divvy up the standards usually equally, but what'll happen is you'll have some target standards, and then you'll have some standards that won't be quite as important. So you have some leeway there. If there are standards that you know are not going to be deal breakers for the student's understanding of mathematical knowledge, you can take that standard and you can make it worth a little less than the other standards. So pretty much for me, standards-based grading boils down to embracing a growth mindset. And here's the key. People who embrace growth mindsets, 2 things happen. 1, we'll embrace growth mindsets for students, but we need to embrace a growth mindset for educators as well. And we also need to make sure that we don't stop a growth mindset when the assessments come. The other thing is with interventions, they're much more targeted with standards-based grading. What I decided to do, because I don't want somebody to continue doing the same thing over and over again, definition of insanity, failing the standard every time, asking why, and it's because they haven't studied it. For me, what students need to do, if they need to retake a standard, they need to come in with me for individualized help for a half hour, either during lunch or after school. And they also have to prove that they've received help from somebody else, another student, teacher, tutoring, professional, tutor, whatever. But they need to get help from me, they need to get help from somebody else, and then grading for learning kicks in. The data are more usable in PLC meetings. The conversations shift from 1 point for this, 1 point for this, 1 point for this, to, okay, we created 3 questions based on standard 1. What do students need to know and be able to do in order to be a 4 or a 3 or a 2? And we'll get together and ask that. My student did this. I think they're a 2. What do you think they are? Retakes are built into every assessment, so you don't have to worry about giving multiple retakes if you thread the standards. We usually spiral curriculum. Well, we should spiral curriculum, but if we're going to spiral curriculum, we should also spiral assessments. And then grading is based on what students know, not what they don't know. And that's one of the most powerful aspects of standards-based grading for me and for the students. I'm going to encourage you to Google Know Your Why and give you a little picture here. I'm not going to play the video right now, but when I play this video and any other aspect of education for teachers really realizing their purpose, knowing why they're in education, knowing why they're using the curriculum they're using, why they're using the pedagogical strategies, people embrace that pretty quickly. But when I talk about knowing your why and being passionate about assessments, then honestly, people kind of look at me like I'm on crack. They think I'm crazy because I'm passionate about assessments. And I get that, because my first 3 years, 4 years of teaching, I had to make a test because I had to give a test, because I had to give a grade, because I'm a teacher. And that wasn't enough for me. I wanted assessments, I wanted the grades to mean something more than that, more than just compliance. So in closing, I just want to leave you with a couple of things, which is that the biggest thing you can take from another human being is their hope. And if you believe that statement, then the corollary to that statement is the biggest thing you can give to another human being is their hope. Depending on the way we grade students, within the first month, K through 12, we are taking hope away from students. And I cannot even begin to tell you how much I can get students to engage in and work in the classroom as long as they know that they can still succeed. And with standards-based grading, with grading for learning, I think that they really truly know that I want them to succeed and my actions fit with my words, because I'm going to give them opportunities to succeed. So with that, I'll take any questions that you have, and thank you for coming to the webinar.
Thanks, Sean. There are a few questions that came through that I'll give you right now.
Okay.
Let's see. I'll pull them up. First is there a cumulative assessment, unit, midterm, final? How do we know that students are retaining the information and putting it all together?
It's a great question. Yes, on 2 fronts. The first one is when we spiral the assessments, what happens is, if I take that standard that I used as an example for linear, quadratic, exponential functions, what happens is every time they get a chance to prove their mastery in that standard, we add something to it to where it's a little more difficult. So what happens if a student in November can show me mastery of a standard that we introduced in September, I would say that that student has mastered it even more than the student who showed that mastery in September. The other thing is we decided, and I kind of agree with this because it never works this way, but some students might have the mindset of, well, it's grading for learning. You're going to replace some grades. I'm going to do nothing. I'm going to take the final exam and then I'm going to get an A in the class. As educators, that has never happened. But what we decided is that's the be all and end all. We do not take our official district-based final exam that's worth a certain percentage of their overall grade and use standards-based grading in that regard. So we thought if we're going to give them multiple opportunities, there has to come a point in time where the students, before they move on, need to show unequivocal mastery. And our final exam was the answer to that. So if they score well on a standard on the final, that's great. But that's the one aspect and the one exam where we don't take and push that back to the rest of the grades.
Thank you. Here's another question that I think related to the particular problem that you showed. And it says, to grade this particular problem, would you use a generalized scale for a cluster of standards, big picture, or a specific rubric for the exact standard it's assessing, smaller learning target?
So we have student-facing rubrics that are, there's a duality of rubrics. One of them is the one that I showed you that I have in the classroom the whole time, which is more conceptually, generally, what is the mindset we need to have to be able to attain a 4, 3, 2, or 1. But within that, yes, we have rubrics that are created for each particular standard. So what'll happen is we'll make the teacher rubric first, and then we'll adapt that because, let's be honest, the things we say as teachers, students have no idea what we're talking about, which they shouldn't. I mean, if I talk about standard number 7.ESSA425, students aren't going to know what we're talking about. So what we do is we make a teacher rubric. We transform that into a student rubric for the particular standard. But then what happens after that is we don't just let it go there. After we've given the assessment, while we're building it, we talk about the rubric. After we give it, we take all of our tests. We've gone through and we've preliminary graded all of our tests. And then we sit down as a PLC as a whole and we have our questionable items. In other words, I'll pull up and I'll say, I think this student's a 3. Everybody take a look at this work. What do you think? Are they a 4? Are they a 2? And we'll go around and we'll talk about actual concrete student work so that we can be more aligned. But then it also helps us because when we do that, we're constantly revising our rubric. So we'll make notes in the rubric so that we can make the rubric better for the next year.
So here's another question. It's from Jackie. Does a 3-point scale work plus the category of 0? Do some schools use SBG yet that do not convert to traditional A, B, C grades for report cards?
There are some schools that, I'm going to reverse this order. There are some schools that do standards-based grading and do not convert. But honestly, those schools, if I had to place money on it, are going to be elementary schools, not middle or high schools. And I'll be 100% honest, when my daughter was a 4th grader, her elementary school converted to standards-based grading. And even for me as an educator with everything I knew, when the 4 was exceeds, I had to stop and go to the teacher and say, what exactly does that mean in terms of exceed standards? So even for me as a parent, I had a little trouble when the school as a whole transition to standards-based grading because I knew what sense I was making of the numbers 4, 3, 2, or 1, but I didn't know what the teachers' meaning of those numbers were. So I needed to know how they were conceptualizing those numbers. A 3-point scale could work. All of them, I hope. Now there's some people who don't include the 0. Please include the 0. There are some students who do the work of a 0. I'm not saying that everybody gets a point and everybody's special and everybody gets an award, but a 3-point scale could work pretty well. And I would say it depends on the standard and it depends on the grade level as well. What matters more to me is not a 3 or a 4 or a 5, but the conversations that you're having with your colleagues about student learning.
Is it possible for a classroom teacher to do SBG when the whole school or district is not?
So I'm going to decide to be 100% honest with that question and say yes, because after the first 2 years of me and a few other teachers piloting standards-based grading, we received, trying to say this nicely, a bit of resistance within the department. And I was asked before the first day of the third year of school started by my department head, well, I was stronger than asked to go back to the traditional grading system. I tend to be an amiable person, and that day, in that circumstance, I said, okay, I'll do what everybody else is doing. But the next morning, I went to the person and respectfully said, no, I see the value in this, and I'm not going to go back to traditional grading. It's far too important for my students, for the conversations that I can have about grades. I'm not going to do something that I think is bad for my students. So during the course of the third year, it went from 5 to 7 people to 3 of us implementing standards-based grading. And even at that low level, there were about 14 people in our department. There were over 100 teachers in my school. Even with the resistance and whatnot, I would say that all 3 of us were very successful. And it created very good conversations within the department meetings about how we're defining grades and what they really mean to us and what they mean to students.
Thank you. Someone says, thank you for the excellent presentation. Oh, wait, here we go. Does SBG tie in with CFAs? Should CFAs match assessments on the report cards at the end of the quarters, which is SBG?
Right. They don't have to, but in my opinion, they should. So overarchingly, and if I'm not answering the question, please let me know, but overarchingly, what I take out of this question is how much alignment should we have? And the answer is as much as is possible without you giving away your professional influence. So one of the things I'm thinking of when you were reading that in terms of alignment overarchingly for the district as a whole is Michael Apple. He talks about, he published a book about 20-ish years ago, and he said that in an educational institution, we ask to be professionals, and the response from the community is sure. He calls it professionalism through intensification. In other words, what that means is we're going to make you feel like you're a professional by intensifying your work, by giving you more and more and more work so you feel like a professional. So it boils down to 2 answers. Number 1, if you have the time, yes, try to align as much as possible. But number 2, question the alignment as well, because if what's happening globally in your district does not align with what you think is good for your students, then you need to, provided you have tenure, of course, push back and try to get that overarching conception of grades to align more with your conception. Because if people are telling you how to grade students in your classroom, I don't care if it's the best math educator who has ever existed on this planet. Nobody's better at determining what your students need than you, because you're the one who spent all that time with them throughout the course of the year. So make the decisions less based on overarching global aspects and more based on what you think professionally your students need.
Can you say what a CFA is? Or I could ask the questioner.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, let's bring somebody else in.
So April Lynn, would you be willing to, let's see, I can find you and I can turn on allowing you to talk if you want to, if you have a speaker, April Lynn, and you can tell us about a CFA.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Terrific.
Hi, thank you for your response. A CFA is a common formative assessment, and in my district, from all grade levels, we're now required to administer them to determine where our students at while we're teaching. But there's still some struggle as some teachers want the CFAs to match the report card finals. So they can tell, like, if, you know, for the grades. Others just want it just for instruction. Some people don't want it at all because they don't want to assess, because assess takes a lot of time. So just trying to gather some more information about it and how it ties to standard-based grading.
Right. And so can I ask you a really quick question? For the CFAs, are you required to grade them a certain way, or does your district grade them?
We are required to grade them in our classroom, but we're meeting this summer to go back and discuss that, because we made a rubric for each of the answers on our math CFAs, but teachers are still grading it, determining, like you said, like how they feel their kids are doing. And some teachers don't like that. They want us to be all on the same page.
Ah, got it. So in terms of, and I'll throw another term. So some districts call it CFA, some districts call it benchmarks, but basically it's you're legally required as an employee of that educational institution to give these assessments. What I will do in those circumstances is I will preserve the integrity of my classroom as much as possible. In other words, because we have certain benchmark exams that we're required to give, generally speaking, the benchmarks do not assess what we've taught. Usually they'll assess something on a benchmark and we'll teach it 3 months later. So letting that aspect of benchmarks or CFAs go. What I'll do is I will grade them in terms of my grading protocol. So when I use standards-based grading, I'll grade them in terms of that. And then that's where the transition comes in, with being able to take that standards-based grading protocol and integrate it into the more traditional grading. So if they want an A, B, C, or D, that's when I use that conversion factor for the district reported grade on it, if that makes sense. So some districts just want the grades. Some districts like mine, they require us to scan them in so that they can keep track of what we're doing with the assessments, and sometimes question how we're grading them. But for the most part, we're just reporting. So I'll grade them with standards-based grading, and then I'll convert that to whatever grade they want as a district. The one thing there as well that you were talking about too is making sure, and I don't know this, if you're required to have the CFAs or the benchmarks be a part of the grade for the students in the classroom. So for that, I ask myself if I'm required to make them a part of the grade in the classroom, then I'll try to preserve student grades as much as possible. In other words, if I see a discrepancy and a student is getting a C on this, I really start to question it. Or conversely, if a student who has an F scores off the charts, then I question the integrity of the exam, and I'll try to make it worth as little as possible. And one of the other things I'll say too, if there's any type of standardized assessment, and CFAs are standardized, localized standardized assessments, what matters for me less is the assessment itself, and what matters for me more is the meaning we're making of the assessment. So if we're determining, and my district does this and some others do as well, if students go on to the next grade level with the CFAs, then that's where I start to have a hard line drawn in the sand. And if it's affecting immensely their grade in my class, that's where I really start to push back. As educators, we tend to be really good at buffering our students from external forces. So as much as you can, use it, but just don't assign too much meaning to one assessment, especially if it's a standardized assessment.
April Ann, did that take care of your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much. You gave me even more information than I expected. So
oh, great, thanks. And if you have my email too, so if you want more information or continue the dialogue, just email me.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. Okay, we have another question. Thank you for the excellent presentation. How much time does your school allot to teacher shared planning and grading?
Not nearly enough. We are PLC. We are allotted every Wednesday after school. So we get out at 2:30. Our contractual hours are until 2:45. Having said that, a lot of teachers, well, we know, work far past their contractual hours. Some don't. Once 2:45 hits, they leave. So every Wednesday at 1:50, we get 55 minutes to meet. We meet from actually more like 45, because people have to wrap up their classroom and get to the PLC. So we're allotted 45 minutes one day a week in order to meet in our PLCs. If people have multiple preps, what that means is you're normally meeting in your PLCs if you're lucky, twice a month. So what happens as a result, and this is one of the things that I was lucky about at the institution I was at, we decided to give teachers as much as possible common preps. So there's two different ways people use preps. So if you're teaching 7th grade math, then we try as much as possible to have all 7th grade math teachers have their planning period during 3rd period or 4th period. So what happens is a lot of times we will, if that works out, meet once a week for the hour during our planning period in order to have the conversations, because there's not enough hours in the day. The points in time where we really need to meet are at the beginning of the unit and at the end of the unit, so that we can get the rubrics set for standards-based grading. And then at the end of the unit, once we give the exam, we usually give each other a couple of days to start grading the tests. And then we will definitely meet to compare the assessments. But the short answer is never enough time.
Okay, that's our questions, and we're approaching 5:30, so I think that's a good time to wind up. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you.
Been very informative. So before we finish, though, we need to do the giveaway of the flip book, and in the must be present to win theme, I'd like to ask everyone who would like to be entered into the drawing for the flip chart, wipe book flip chart, to type in the chat flip chart and your name. So I'm going to type flip chart George Reese in the chat, and that means that I would be entered into the drawing. So I see flip chart Carol Jones and flip chart Kim Dormeyer and flip chart April Ann Lynch. So yes, so those are coming through the chat. So put that in there. So we will enter you into the drawing for this cool. And by the way, I'm not really entered into it. It will be some other attendee, but you get the idea. So put your entry in, and we will randomly pick from one of the attendees to win that white book flip chart. And if there are, oh, and I see Keith, he put his in the question and answer. So just to make sure I see it later, I'm going to put in flip chart Keith Drew. So I know he's in there. And great, don't see any other questions. So we are recording this. Some people had some internet issues and asked if we were recording it, and we are. So the recording should be available in a day or two. You will also receive information about PDUs, PD hours via email. And again, I encourage you to join ICTM so that we can keep doing things like this. And we had a wonderful workshop last Saturday that was free for ICTM members at Pose and Robbins Middle School or Intermediate School. So there are great things going on. Where will the link for the recording be? We will send it out to the attendees. It should also be available on the ICTM webinar on the ICTM site, which if you go to it, you'll see a link for webinars in the menu. And let me share that actually. So ICTM.org, and in the menu should be resources, and ICTM webinars will take you to a page with our list of webinars. And when the link is hot, it should take you to a video of the past webinars. So on this ICTM.org/ICTM-webinars page, you can see any of the past webinars as they have been going up on YouTube. It takes us a little bit to turn the recording into an MP3 and upload the video to YouTube. You can also go to our YouTube channel, but I would say come to ictm.org/ICTM-webinars, and that will give you the full list. So thank you for that question, Robert. And I will stop sharing. I think we've answered all the questions. Someone asked, what's the speaker's name? The speaker is Sean Nank, and Nank, right? Is there a place, do you have a web page, Sean, that you would point us to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. It's really complicated. It's my name.
Okay.
It's www.seannank.com, SEANNANK. And then I gave you my email on the slide, but if within there's a link to an email that funnels into my personal email. So if you ever want to contact me, please feel free to just hit the link and tell me you were a part of the webinar. And the thing that excites me the most is the conversations that happen after. So if you're in the thick of it, if you're thinking about doing it, if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me.
Terrific. Thank you, Sean. And that has the picture of you with the haircut.
With the short hair, I need to change that.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I think with that, we are adjourned. Good night, everyone.
Thanks. Night.